Wherever you travel, the whole world over, there's nothing to compare with the unique and treasured atmosphere of the Great British Pub. Visitors and locals alike can gather at the bar to drink one another's health, and no matter how far you travel, the length and breadth of the country, you'll never find any two pubs to be the same. Each hostelry has a character all its own, some by virtue of historic significance, others because of famous characters who drank there. Occasionally, a sinister tale will dominate, and often, quite simply, a pub's location will distinguish it for special notice. There are smugglers' pubs, old coaching inns, country house taverns, theme pubs, ghostly hideaways, and even the odd murderer's haunt. King's Heads, Crossed Keys, Green Dragons, Red or White Lions, Royal Oaks, and new inns abound on every street corner, and you certainly never have to look very far to find one of these traditional watering holes. However, such fine establishments are more than purveyors of beer and the ubiquitous pork scratching, because there's a whole microcosm of national history and sociology encapsulated for posterity within the walls of almost every Great British pub. To find the pub's origins, you do have to travel back some considerable distance in time, as beer has been brewed for thousands of years. As early as 2000 BC, special houses where beer could be sociably consumed were commonplace in locations as exotic as Babylon and ancient Egypt. The Romans brought taberners to Britain in about 43 AD, the forerunners of the tavern, but it was wine that was on offer at regular intervals along the straight military roads that they built, rather than beer. When the Romans departed, taking with them such civilised notions as baths, central heating, and wine drinking, their successors, the Angles, Saxons and Danes, were much more interested in beer than a decent drop of Chianti. Consequently, the brewing of beer or ale became a much valued skill executed on a daily basis by the women of Britain. Each householder had her own way of doing things, and needless to say, some were rather better at brewing than others. People would gather at the homes where the best beer was made, sit a while, drink, make merry, and swap stories. And this is fundamentally how the public house began in Britain more than 1,000 years ago. Some of the most attractive and ancient pubs that you'll find scattered around the land are to be found in small country villages and hamlets. It's often said today that the pub is at the heart of British village life rather than the church, as was once the case. The battle between the church and the demon drink was particularly bitter during the late 19th and first half of the 20th century, with the incumbent clergy and morally upstanding souls of the parish frequently berating the local pub. But in point of fact, if you go back far enough in history, you'll find that the ecclesiastical establishment was responsible for the creation of many pubs. Throughout the Middle Ages, monasteries grew and flourished, with great churches and cathedrals being built, bringing visitors from all walks of life, ranging from influential clergymen to devoted pilgrims and even tradesmen. All needed to be accommodated, fed, watered, and provided with a place to sleep. Equally, the manpower required to build such huge religious edifices needed to be housed. Skilled carpenters and stonemasons could be required on site for months. So many public houses were not only established by the church, but were also operated by ecclesiastical hosts. To this day, you'll still see pubs named with religious symbols. The Cross Keys is a classic allegory for entry into the kingdom of heaven, and hostelries named after the Lamb have equally sacred origins. This certainly accounts for the creation of a fair proportion of British pubs, but by no means all of them. The nation's great country estates and their aristocratic owners also had a major role to play in the establishment of the pub as an institution. Estate workers were often paid a proportion of their wages in beer, which was brewed and served in a pub owned and frequently named after the lord of the manor. For many centuries of British history, travel was undertaken very definitely for business rather than pleasure, and this was reflected in the most basic conditions that were to be found at roadside inns. However, from the 1600s onwards, travel became more commonplace, and pubs started to offer a much greater level of comfort. Roads also improved. By the latter half of the 18th century, the advent of the mail coach necessitated an even more sophisticated and efficient service. A journey from Bristol to London could be completed in less than 24 hours, but was reliant upon the horses being changed about every 15 miles. The post horn would sound away in the distance, and the innkeeper would leap into action. Guests would be greeted as they stepped down from the coach, their every need swiftly attended to, while grooms tackled up fresh horses and cared for those being replaced. The hustle and bustle would have added an extra air of romance to travel, and the great English writer Charles Dickens made good use of his experiences of coaching inns throughout his novels. This is the Royal Victoria in Rochester, well known to Dickens, as his beloved home, Gad's Hill Place, stood just a few miles away. A coaching inn has been serving refreshment to weary travellers on this very spot for over 400 years, although it was always known as the Bull before a young Princess Victoria stayed here in 1836. The inn actually features in the Pickwick Papers as the Bull, but it underwent a minor name change to the Blue Boar in Great Expectations. However, it's as well that this much revered author immortalised the coaching inns, as their prosperity was rather short-lived. A new form of transport came steaming over the horizon in the 1820s with the advent of the railways. Within 30 years, railway mania had swept the country, and the thriving wayside inn had been demoted to the humble status of the local pub. Old coaching inns are to be found all over Britain, and are certainly some of the most historically interesting hostelries that you'll encounter on any tour of this nation's great pubs. So that's quite enough history to be going on with, because of course what any pub enthusiast really wants is to take a closer look at the real thing, a selection of the very best of great British pubs. Where better, then, to begin than at the very heart of the great British countryside, where the rolling English hills appear tranquil and undisturbed. But this hasn't always been the case. Far from it, as throughout history many battles have been fought over this hallowed ground, with control of the nation depending significantly upon possession of this green and pleasant land. Standing proud on the Edgehill escarpment, overlooking the ancient battlefields of yesteryear, you'll find the appropriately named Castle Inn, where the modern-day traveller will not only experience a superb pint of beer and traditional pub fare, but also a great sense of history. Let your mind wander back through time. The date is 1642, and Britain was on the verge of civil war. The reigning monarch, King Charles I, was ranged against his government, and his attempts to silence dissension resulted in a parliamentary uprising. Standing in the bar today, it's hard to believe that King Charles raised his standard on this very spot, the day before the opening skirmish of a war that would divide the nation, turn brother against brother, and cause one of the greatest upheavals in British history. However, take a good look out at the view, and you'll soon appreciate why this was chosen as a strategic vantage point. Dawn on the morning of October the 23rd, 1642, heralded the Battle of Edge Hill, fought out under the shadow of this great escarpment. Despite the natural advantage of the King's hilltop encampment and early success, poor strategy allowed the advancing parliamentarians to rally. At the end of the day, honours were even, but thousands lay dead across the blood-splattered landscape. Needless to say, there was no convenient alehouse here then in which the king could drown his sorrows, and his failure to hit home his advantage at Edgehill contributed greatly to his subsequent defeat and execution in 1649. The castle was actually built in 1750 of the distinctive local ironstone, which has a charming golden red hue. If you've the time to travel down the hill to the picturesque village of Radway, once you've enjoyed the pleasures of this most welcoming hostelry, the houses and church are all built of this lovely stone, and the trip is well worth the effort. After the peace and tranquillity of Edge Hill and the lovely Warwickshire countryside, heading for London, England's ever-busy capital city, will come as something of a culture shock. However, fear not, because when it comes to pubs, there are some fascinating specimens to choose from. You do need to keep your eyes open as you wander around, because with modern architectural additions and renovations, it's easy to miss some of the most traditional gems. Ye Olde Cheshire cheese is a prime example, and for most people walking past, its great history goes completely unnoticed. For those of a literary turn of mind, this is undoubtedly a place of pilgrimage, because the world-famous diarist Samuel Pepys regularly drank here. In later years, the scholarly Dr. Johnson enjoyed taking refreshment at the bar, as his house was conveniently situated just around the corner. With such a literary pedigree, it'll hardly come as a surprise that even the great Charles Dickens came to drink here, no doubt finding inspiration for a number of his very colourful characters within. While still on a literary theme, the Globe Inn is not a particularly fascinating pub, but its location is of significant interest. This is a perfect example of a public house connected with a famous person, namely William Shakespeare, perhaps the greatest dramatist of all time. Just a short distance away, you'll discover the wonderfully detailed reproduction of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre. London theatregoers can watch Shakespeare as it was first performed, open to the elements and in the round. It's great fun, and for anyone who perceives Shakespeare as the province of academics, it'll also be a truly enlightening experience. An Elizabethan audience was very vocal, and if a play failed to entertain, they would happily hurl missiles of rotten fruit and vegetables at the offending actors. Today, throwing decaying matter is pretty much discouraged, but performances can be just as noisy as in Shakespeare's time, with plenty of audience participation. The impact Shakespeare had on 16th century London was dramatic indeed, encouraging thousands into the theatres, and this particular area of the city has many monuments to the great man. However, with what we know of Shakespeare and his life in London, notably his love of wine, women and song, a public house built and named in his honour would no doubt be his most favourite of memorials. After such a pleasant sojourn around the London pubs that are so rich in literary culture, we now step into a part of the city that has a dark and desperate history. In the autumn of 1888, the Whitechapel district of London was terrorised for a time by Jack the Ripper, a vicious serial killer who preyed upon poor, unfortunate ladies of the night who sold themselves short for the price of a glass of gin. At the corner of Commercial and Fournier Street stands the 10 Bells pub, a gruesome landmark strongly associated with this season of dastardly crime. Undoubtedly, all of the victims were familiar with this pub, both for drinking and for plying their trade. Reports suggest that Mary Kelly, the last and perhaps the most notorious of the women to die at the Ripper's hand, claimed her pitch directly outside the pub. If accounts are to be believed, she defended her territory fiercely, and woe betide any competitor who overstepped Mary's boundaries. But sadly, she was no match for the knife-wielding murderer. Today, the 10 Bells can be taken in as part of a guided Jack the Ripper's London walking tour of the district. A fascinating experience for those with nerves of steel. It's a gruesome tale that's told, atmospheric and dark, so be warned. There was a brief era in the 1970s and 80s when the 10 Bells was renamed the Jack the Ripper, but objections from various pressure groups ensured that this grisly hostelry reverted back to its original name. Who can say what the future holds for this historic pub? As for the present, it can hardly be described as salubrious or even macabrely inviting. Yet it's still worth searching out the 10 Bells, where a particularly unpleasant set of circumstances render it of interest, and its inclusion is certainly justified on this tour of great British pubs. While we're on the subject of blood and gore, Our next destination has an equally terrifying side to its history. Not that you'd expect to find anything spine-chilling in the gloriously golden and timelessly elegant Georgian city of Bath. But this is an old tale of drinking, gambling and treachery, with one of Bath's best-loved pubs at the very heart of it. This is the Garrick's Head, which was built in 1730 for the great dandy and gentleman of manners, Beau Nash, as a private gaming house. There are a number of Garrick's Head pubs across Great Britain, a name chosen to honour David Garrick, the renowned 18th century Shakespearean actor. Conveniently situated next to the Theatre Royal and Beau Nash's private residence, this Garrick's Head was connected to both properties by a series of underground tunnels, allowing any illegal card players an anonymous escape route. Today, this pub is very popular with theatre-goers, as the many famous portraits confirm, but it's a well-known fact that the place is haunted. The year was 1780, and a fine lady was staying at the Garrick's Head. Her lover was busy at cards in the gaming room, but his opponent had fallen for his lady's charms and challenged the man to a duel. She fled to her room as the two men clashed swords, and then she heard the victor's cry. It was not a voice she recognised. Her lover had been slain. In grief and horror, the lady threw herself from the window, dying in a pool of blood in the street below, rather than be claimed as a prize by the conquering duellist advancing upon her. To this day, people claim to hear her sobs and screams in the pub and along the little side street where her fate was sealed. But to hear the duellists, you need to venture down into the depths of the vault below the theatre. The Theatre Royal Bath is a beautiful example of a provincial playhouse, and many quality performances are presented each year on this well-trodden stage. However, make your way down to the theatre's vaults and you'll find not only a superb wine bar and restaurant, but also the blocked-up entrance to Beau Nash's escape tunnel. It's here that two duellists are often heard crashing about and cursing each other to damnation. For anyone in search of pleasant refreshment, this is a very good corner of Bath to look out for, because today all three of these historic properties are licensed. The Garrick's Head is, as we've seen, an excellent pub. The theatre's vaults house a more trendy wine bar, and the adjoining house that once belonged to Beau Nash is now an elegant restaurant that the dandy himself would have heartily approved of.
Oh, as I was going over the Cock and Kerry mountains, I met Captain Farrell and his money he was counting. I first produced my pistol and then produced my rapier, saying, "Stand and deliver, for the devil he may take ya. Bisharim Ramadoo Ramadar, whack for my daddy-o."
Well, that's quite enough of bloody murder and ghostly apparitions to be going on with. It's about time we visited a place of good cheer. After all, that's what great British pubs are about, and our next destination will definitely give a lift to any flagging spirit. Welcome to Keele Castle, a veritable sanctuary for the great Irish drinking song, where such classics as Whiskey in the Jar, The Irish Rover and Danny Boy ring out with cheerful regularity. Now hang on a minute, did I hear you cry? Isn't this a programme about great British pubs? What have the Cork and Kerry mountains and pints of frothing Guinness got to do with the British pub scene? Surprising as it may sound, there hasn't been an error. The Irish Sea has not been crossed, and you're not in a little hideaway amongst the rolling green hills of Ayr. Keele Castle is in fact at the very heart of Birmingham, wedged between the blackened terraces of the Industrial Revolution and Balti houses with exotic aromas and an equally distinctive imported culture of their own. Birmingham, like many of Britain's thriving cities, has a large Irish community, and here at the Keele Castle you'll come across Irish folk from all walks of life. But don't think that this experience is exclusively for those with connections to the Emerald Isle, because the Irish theme pub is a phenomenon that, as well as sweeping the British Isles, has also been exported all over the world. Amongst the dance clubs of Ibiza or the diners of New York, you'll find a plethora of Irish bars, Mad O'Rourke's, McGinty's, or even Molly Malone's wherever you go. In no other culture is the Celtic magic so hospitable, or the storytelling so inclusive. If you've time to listen, there's always a good yarn being spun, or a musical interlude to be shared. The renovation work at Keele Castle has been ongoing since 1999, with traditional open hearths, stone walls and timber floorboards all adding to the atmosphere. As a venue for Irish music, the stage has welcomed many of the great performers, bringing enthusiastic audiences from all over the country. Today we have the up-and-coming Wild Green, giving us their unique rendition of these timeless favourites, and next week, who knows who it might be. But one thing's for certain, no one will ever tire of these great Irish classics, and every single person in the bar can tap their feet, clap their hands, and sing along to their heart's content. If Ireland has only squeezed into this programme on a technicality, our next pub takes us to Scotland, cartographically part of the British Isles. But historically, the place that we are now off to has far from rejoiced at being governed from London, as this is Speyside, home of the very best single malt. As early as the 17th century, whisky was heavily taxed, and many an illegal bubbling steaming still was hidden from the English revenue men in crofts, cow sheds, and any convenient crevice that could be found. It soon became a point of principle for every true Scot to defy the English laws, and illicit whisky production soared. Fortunately today, all legalities have long since been settled, and the pub we're visiting has a quite remarkable selection of whiskies to tempt the appreciative palate. Tucked away on the ancient Ballindalloch estate in Banffshire, any weary traveller would be pleased to spot the welcoming lights of the Delnashore Hotel. Once the province of drovers, that hardy breed of Scot famous for transporting cattle from the Highlands to market, today it doubles as a fishing lodge as well as a traditional pub. The food here is definitely worthy of mention, with a traditional menu and generous hospitable helpings. Set before you is a feast of haggis and clapshot, minus the sheep stomach casing that's normally associated with this Scottish offal dish. Incidentally, if you inquire of your host the constituents of clapshot, you may end up none the wiser when they reply, "Neeps and tatties." But it's most easily explained as potato and turnip mashed together. If you want to take a wee dram with your meal, here's a brief whisky masterclass. For a mild, mellow experience, the blended whiskies such as Bell's or Johnnie Walker are great for the novice. Here on Speyside, you must of course sample the local single malts. Glenfiddich and Glenfarclas are warming and full of flavour with a delicate character. But if you want to go for the connoisseur's tipple, give the Islay malts a shot. Lagavulin is a classic example of the peaty brew that this wonderful isle produces. But be warned, it's powerful stuff and may prove to be an acquired taste.
Hey Johnny Cope, are you walking yet? Or are your drums beating yet? If you were a walking, then I would wait to gang to the coals in the morning.
For our next pub, we'll remain north of the border, but take a southerly turn towards Scotland's capital, Edinburgh. The great castle on its crag and tail looks out across the distinctive skyline to Arthur's Seat, an extinct volcano that dominates this beautiful city. Here, crouched in the shadow of Arthur's Seat, you'll discover the picturesque village of Duddingston and the remarkable Sheep Head Inn. Many a famous historical figure has supped the fine ale at this hostelry, dating back to the 1500s, and James VI of Scotland, who eventually succeeded to the English throne as well, becoming King James I. This was a popular watering hole for the royal wild boy, and his gift to the landlord of an embellished snuff box with a ram's head was undoubtedly for very questionable services rendered. In later years, the Sheep Head was often frequented by Bonnie Prince Charlie, while he and his army were encamped in Edinburgh, and it's claimed that the Jacobite leader spent the night here before his famous victory at the Battle of Prestonpans. What's more, it's not just famous people that give the Sheep Head an antiquarian atmosphere, because tucked out at the back of the pub is Scotland's oldest skittle alley. This is a popular pub game played all over Great Britain, but nowhere else is it quite so demanding as it is in Scotland. The pins are huge and very heavy, with the bowler left prostrate on the ground after taking his shot. It might not be the most elegant of pastimes, but it's certainly great fun, and quite a serious business for those who play regularly. Fortunately, the menu has evolved from the days of the old boards that advertise every delicacy that could possibly be concocted out of a sheep's head. The resourceful locals let nothing go to waste after marketing the rest of the meat, and consequently all manner of dishes were devised to tempt the hungry traveller, so long that is, as a sheep's head was to their taste. Before heading further south for the remaining pubs on this tour, it's a perfect time to take a closer look at an old traveller's inn, which even has its own liveried coach in the modern-day car park. This pub is called the Highwayman, after the notorious criminals who made their living robbing stagecoaches along the highways and byways of Great Britain. The terrifying cry of "Stand and deliver, your money or your life," struck a chord of fear with travellers everywhere. But at this particular spot it wasn't the highwayman that would have relieved you of your money, despite the attractive sign that blows in the wind. A road has passed this way since Roman times, linking settlements at Glevum and Corinium, and for many years the old beach pike, as this thoroughfare was more commonly known, was a toll road. As well as being a toll house, charging a fee for the privilege of journeying past, it was also a wonderful coaching inn, linking London with the West, which this busy dual carriageway still does to this day. Inside the lovely old building, you'll find a classic example of a much-loved country pub. Cotswold stone walls and open hearth fires are always welcoming, and of course no such inn could be worthy of the name if it failed to supply a good choice of beer, ranging from Old Speckled Hen to the dogs you know what's. Our next port of call takes us to the world-famous village of Haworth on the bleak, windswept Yorkshire moors, home to the literary Bronte family. At the top of the cobbled streets, you'll find the parsonage, where Charlotte, Emily and Anne wrote their classic novels. But unbeknown to most, the three sisters had a brother, who would have been well qualified to take us on a tour of the local pubs. This is the Black Bull, where Branwell Bronte was to be found roaring drunk on many a winter's night. Unfortunately, as his father was the local vicar, it caused much embarrassment. If you go into the pub today, you can still find Branwell's chair, but he was by no means the only resident of Haworth to prefer the comforts of this pub if local folklore is to be believed. Between 1742 and 1763, the Reverend William Grimshaw presided over the Church of St. Michael and All Angels, a serious man of God who was apparently in possession of a very fine whip. If his congregation failed to materialise for Sunday services, the ardent preacher would march down the hill, whip in hand, to the Black Bull and round up the lapsed worshippers. Fortunately, this was a good few years before Branwell Bronte's time, particularly as his other addiction was for opium, which he purchased from the old apothecary opposite the Black Bull. The Reverend William Grimshaw would definitely have had a few stern words to say to young Mr. Bronte, should he have ever come within shouting distance of the pulpit, something the wayward Branwell would no doubt have avoided at all cost. To have one pub of such interest in a village the size of Haworth is fortunate. To have a second hostelry equally worthy of note makes this a perfect destination for the pub connoisseur. At the top of the high street stands the Old White Lion, a beautiful 300-year-old coaching inn. Just a stone's throw from the Bronte Parsonage Museum, this is a popular hotel with visitors, and the hospitality is second to none. Like many ancient pubs, there's a ghost story told of things going bump in the night within these walls. However, it's not a spirit from centuries past that allegedly haunts the White Lion, but an adventurous young woman from 1906. Lily Cove was Britain's first female balloonist, and unfortunately, while flying in the area, she became detached from her parachute and plummeted to her death. Lily's body was laid out in the Old White Lion while arrangements were made for her burial, and it would seem that her spirit never actually departed the premises. This will come as no surprise for the modern-day visitor to this lovely old pub, with spectacular views down the picturesque High Street. It's not the kind of place anyone would be in a hurry to leave, whether it be for this life or the next. In the introduction to this programme, you were promised an old smuggler's inn, and what better to offer than the most famous of them all, Jamaica Inn, high up on Bodmin Moor in Cornwall. At first glance it appears an awful long way from the sea to be anything to do with contraband, but when you delve a little deeper into smuggling at Old Jamaica, you'll discover that much of its awesome reputation comes from the 1930s, and a guest staying at the hotel with a rare talent for spinning a fireside yarn. Daphne du Maurier, one of England's most popular 20th century writers, was inspired by this grey stone coaching inn, perched high up on what is still the main visitor route into Cornwall today. The tale she told of Jamaica Inn has encouraged perhaps millions of readers over the years since publication to make a pilgrimage to this very spot. Step inside and you'll find the names of her famous characters all around. Young country girl Mary Yellen came to live here with her aunt Patience, a sad wreck of a woman married to the evil, black-hearted landlord of Jamaica Inn, Jos Merlin. In the dead of night, he led a murderous band of smugglers and wreckers, with the plundered booty always brought back from the beaches to Jamaica Inn. There's Mary's Bar, and even a plaque marking the place where Jos Merlin was eventually killed, while local magistrate Squire Bassett presides over the enormous restaurant. If you choose to stay the night, the bedrooms are all named after the immortal protagonists of Daphne du Maurier's story, and working out which of them have four-poster beds is great fun. It's very easy to get completely caught up in the atmosphere of this incredible story, and everything is presented in keeping with the novel, so anyone fortunate enough to know the book will be enchanted. But fear not, if you've never heard of Daphne du Maurier and Jamaica Inn before, there's plenty of information about the great lady in the Daphne du Maurier room. Recreated with her desk and typewriter, as well as a superb collection of artifacts, all your questions will be answered, and with a well-stocked gift shop, you can always buy your own copy of Jamaica Inn to enjoy at leisure. It's hard to believe on this cold, bleak, windy night, with the courtyard deserted, that there are times when you quite literally have to fight your way through massive crowds just to get in. Be warned, on summer Saturdays, this is a favourite stopping-off point for holidaymakers travelling south. Coaches fill the car park, and although Jamaica Inn is very accommodating, you won't be able to truly appreciate the magic of the place. Now, if it's real smugglers that you're looking for, rather than the literary variety, continue your journey southwards and you'll come to the lovely Cornish village of Polperro. This is a real smuggler's delight, and the narrow streets next to the sheltered safe harbour can only be described as a rabbit warren of hiding places. Who can guess the secrets that these silent nooks and crannies hold, and how much wine, tobacco, silk and brandy made its way into Britain via this sleepy hillside fishing village? At the top of the hill, you'll find the Crumplehorn Inn, dominating the landscape. There's been a mill on this site since the time of the Domesday Book in the 11th century, and the old mill wheel is still a very attractive feature. Corn was, in fact, still ground here until the 1950s, a measure of the ancient traditions upheld in this community. Enter the bars and restaurants of the Crumpelhorn and you'll receive an equally traditional welcome. In the summer months, a cool, refreshing pint will certainly please, and on a cold winter's night, the roaring fires and warming spirits will comfort the soul. This truly is an inn for all seasons, with a different character for almost every month of the year. The Crumpelhorn is also famous for its ghosts, and a spectral man's figure has often been seen in the bar. Doors mysteriously open and close while the place is empty, leading folk to surmise that he may be a long-dead smuggler in search of a hidden store of brandy. There's also a portrait of a fisherman in one of the bedrooms that is thought to be responsible for ghostly goings-on. This time, light seemed to be the speciality of this phantom menace, with guests waking in the middle of the night to find the room brightly illuminated, with every light having been mysteriously switched on. However, this certainly doesn't put people off from staying the night here. Far from it. Some come especially hoping for an encounter with one of the Crumpelhorn's ghosts. With time almost up on this tour of great British pubs, you may have worked out that Welsh public houses have been conspicuous by their absence, and our next destination will, in quite a bizarre way, rectify this omission. This is the Boat Inn, a superb example of a small local pub that has withstood the many tests of time with great resourcefulness. It also sits quite literally on the border between England and Wales. The car park and the rest of the village officially is English. But when you cross the old Wye Valley Railway Bridge to get to the boat, you'll find yourself on Welsh soil. In times past, this was a thriving boat-building area, and no doubt this has given rise to this pub's very appropriate name. To reinforce this, it's also more than likely that much of this pub's beer would have been delivered by boat, and today it's still beer, or real ale to be more accurate, that this pub is famous for. This part of Britain, classic border country, is on the fringes of the beautiful Royal Forest of Dean. As well as producing first-class timber, the area was always famous for its rich mineral lodes. Free miners, men born within the forest, were entitled to dig for the rich deposits. There's little evidence of the free miners today, but one great tradition remains, namely the Free Miner Brewery in the nearby town of Colford. The Boat Inn stocks a wide selection of this wonderful, locally brewed beer, with a character all its own. For anyone who has a love of traditional real ale, this is definitely the place to come. Staying within the bounds of the Forest of Dean, and the St Breville's 100 to be more precise, we come to the last pub on our Great British tour. The village of St Breville's today is a quiet rural backwater, and although it boasts a fine Norman castle, not something that many settlements of this size can do, there's very little else here of note at first glance. But like the hundreds of tiny villages the length and breadth of Great Britain, the local pub is the very greatest treasure of all. The George Inn is a charming, whitewashed building at the outer edge of the castle's once impressive moat. In summer months, the courtyard garden is full of colourful pub umbrellas, and visitors and locals alike enjoy a pleasant alfresco drink. However, in winter, the bright, welcoming lights at the old mullioned windows invite everyone to step inside. And what a treat awaits. This is the epitome of everything good about the Great British Country Pub. A friendly atmosphere, glowing log fires, and a wonderful selection of real ale, not to mention fine wines, spirits, and a few home-brew specialities, all go to enhance the experience. The George has been a free house since the 16th century, which means that it's never been owned by one of the major breweries, so a unique style has always been maintained. Take a quick glance at the enormous chalked-up menu boards, and you'll soon realise that you can expect much more than a ploughman's lunch in this establishment. Critics the world over have labelled English food as stodgy, uninteresting, and lacking in flavour. Well, they've obviously never been to the George at St Breville's, because the seasonally adjusted, home-cooked dishes are a shining example of English cuisine at its very best. As the embers of the George's magnificent fire fade and die, this tour of Great British pubs reaches its ultimate conclusion. With last orders called, everyone's allowed a few minutes' grace to sup up before making their merry way home, full of good cheer at an evening well spent. But here's the best bit. They can do it all again tomorrow, and hopefully you'll have been sufficiently inspired by this programme to search out great British pubs for yourselves, wherever in the country you might happen to be.